Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our third Lenten session for this year. It's lovely to have you back with us, and we hope you've been enriched by the journey so far. And it's great to have you with us. As always, we begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we gather today, the waterways and the air, the environment in which we live. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and emerging. Now, David, would like to ask you to read our opening prayer this week. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everybody. Jesus, the Spirit hurried you from the Jordan River to the desert, and then in Galilee to preach the coming of the kingdom. May this Spirit stir in our hearts too, to hear your call to us, in turn to draw to you the people whom we meet by the silence of a peaceful heart, by the gentle hands of friendship, by the faithfulness of presence, by the courage to stick by the despised, and by the match between our words and lives. May we follow you along the winding road that curls through joy and sadness, through delight and disappointment, and through death, with you to life, with you forever.
Amen to that. Thanks, David. And we'll just turn over to Mary to lead us into the first reading for this coming Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everyone. It's a joy to be with you again. This evening we have another of the covenants, the account of another of the covenants from Exodus 20. And now I can't make my machine go forward. There we go. I thought it was important to contextualize this covenant. So the book before Exodus, which is Genesis, and the last 2 weeks we've had text from Genesis. The first 11 chapters of Genesis tell the prehistory, the accounts of events before any recorded history, myths, if you like, in the best sense of myths. And in that section, we encountered the first week, the story of Noah and God's covenant with Noah and with all living things. The next section of Genesis is chapters 12 to 50, and it's the story of the patriarchs and matriarchs. And that includes the covenant with Abraham and all of his descendants. Then we move into the book of Exodus, and there is a clear connection between these two books. And the first 4 chapters are setting the scene, really, and setting the scene particularly for Israel's slavery in Egypt. Then in chapters 5 to 15, we have the plagues, the coming out of Egypt, the Exodus in the purest sense of the word, and the crossing of the sea, the crossing of the Reed Sea. Followed almost immediately, and I know this in my life, and I suspect you know it in your lives, straight away when things aren't going as well as we hope, there's a bit of grumbling. And so there is grumbling even before they reach Mount Sinai, before the people reach Mount Sinai. Then we come to the section in which our text tonight is found, and it's the section about the covenant at Mount Sinai, the covenant between God and the people of Israel, the people God brings out of Egypt, out of the slavery of Egypt, and they begin the long journey to the land. But the first part of the journey is to Mount Sinai, and that's where we encounter them. And then after that section, the final section of the book of Exodus, it tells the story of the golden calf and the renewal of the covenant, and has a lot of legal material, which has liturgical and legal material about the tabernacle, about different feasts, etc. So that's the context in which of the whole movement of the two books that we're looking at. Then we come to our text. And I just remind you that Exodus 1 to 20 is mainly narrative, and Exodus 21 to 40 is mainly legal material. As I said, a lot of it about liturgy and feasts and tabernacles and all of that, but inserted there. And there's even more legal material in the book of Leviticus. But we're in that transition stage with Exodus 20. So Exodus 19, the people reach Mount Sinai, and God asks Moses to tell the people to prepare, to wash their clothes and to consecrate themselves, because they will have an encounter with God. God will come down on the mountain, and God promises that if the people keep the covenant, they will be God's treasured possession. In Exodus 19:17, it says, Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. And that's what happens here at the foot of Mount Sinai. So the whole scene is set. And then immediately in chapter 20, it says, then God spoke all these words. So they've prepared for this encounter. The people are a little afraid. So they say, well, Moses, you speak to God and then tell us here. But it just says, then God spoke all these words. He said, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And that is establishing God's credentials in a way. I'm the God of history. I brought you out of Egypt. And then they are told, you shall have no gods except me. And then we engage in this next part, the God of creation, if you like, because it says, you shall not make yourselves a carved image or any likeness of anything in heaven or on earth beneath or in the waters under the earth. And traditionally, the other societies had different gods of these different spheres. But here, the God of Israel is proclaiming that she is the God of all creation. So the credentials of God are really the God of history and the God of creation. And it's that God that tells the people the 10 words, as they're often called, or the 10 commandments, as we sometimes say. And the 10 commandments continue. You shall not make yourselves a carved image of any likeness of anything in heaven, on earth beneath, or the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, and I punish the father's fault on the sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons of those who hate me. But I show kindness, chesed, to thousands, and it means in the context thousands of generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So this God who does, if you like, for justice sake, punish those who work against God's ways, who hate me, the text says, but is a God of kindness for thousands of generations for those who cooperate with God. And then the text has God continuing. You shall not utter the name of the Lord your God. So the image of God, they are not to make images for God. And now they're not to utter the name of the Lord their God to misuse it. They're not to utter it to misuse it. The next commandment, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you labor to do all your work. but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not work that day, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your servants, men or women, nor your animals, nor the slave who lives with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that these hold, but on the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord has blessed the seventh day and made it sacred. And we'll see later that in Deuteronomy, again, the 10 Commandments are listed, but a different reason is given in Deuteronomy. Here, it's because God kept the Sabbath in the time of creation. The next commandment, honor your father and your mother so that you may live a long life in the land which the Lord has given to you. It's the only one of the commands that doesn't have not or lo in Hebrew in it. It's a very positive command here. Honor your father and your mother. And then they become shorter. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his servant, man or woman, or his ox or his donkey, or anything that is his. So these are the commands that God speaks, situated at the people are situated at the foot of Mount Sinai. God is speaking from the mountain. And these are the conditions, these are the requirements of the covenant that is established between God and the people of Israel. And these are the commandments that we have, as Christians, also taken very seriously. So the number 10 is not mentioned in the text. We always say the 10 commandments. The number 10 is not mentioned in the text. And Jewish and Christian traditions divide and count the commandments slightly differently, but in both traditions, the number 10 is used, even though, as I said, the text does not specify. So the 10 commandments here in Exodus 20, as part of that covenantal relationship, they're not just laws out of the blue, they are part of that relationship, and that is so, so important. In Deuteronomy, in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, where Moses is reminding the people of all that has happened to them, a different reason is given for keeping the Sabbath. And here in Deuteronomy 5, the reason is, remember that you were a slave in Egypt. And slaves can't have a rest day. So as a reminder that they were slaves, they are to keep Sabbath. Now, both those reasons are true to their story, and both those reasons are important for us to consider today. Because one suggests that we would keep Sabbath, or we would keep a Sabbath in imitation of God, in imitation of what God did when in creating. And the other suggests the Deuteronomy 5 form of the command suggests that we keep the Sabbath because we remember that we were slaves. The people are to remember that they were slaves. We remember slavery, and we don't want to be enslaved to anything. And then there's a third form of the commandments in Exodus 34, which has a more of a ritual focus. We won't go into that. So we note in our first reading that the commandments are about the people's relationship with God. The first of the commandments are about the people's relationship with God, and that the last 6 are clearly about what it means to make a community or a society work. They are much more for the relations between the people, but they are considered within the context of the covenant. So they are part of the relationship with God, but God obviously wants community, society to work. So the relationship with God and with each other are part of the covenant. We have religious or godly responsibilities, as the first commands suggest, and we have social responsibilities. And both of these are important. It's not simply about piety, it's about responsibilities to society, about social teaching. So the covenant is really worth pondering, and the church puts before us this covenant in these days of Lent, so that the call to prayer, to penance, and to fasting are linked to the covenant. They don't come to us out of nowhere. They come to us out of the covenant, out of a relationship with God. And they come to us out of a relationship with the community and society in which we live, both being important. Finally, I just want to comment a little bit on the God we encounter in this text from Exodus. So God speaks directly to the people and uses the second person, you. And it's you in the singular, so he's addressing them as one people. But God speaks directly to them. It's an I-thou relationship. It's not telling them about what they might do. It's speaking to them. God gives God's credentials, Lord of history and creator of the cosmos, and both are important. So this God is worthy of our engagement, worthy of our relationship. And finally, that God is a jealous God. And it can also be translated zealous, but it does carry the connotation of jealous in terms of even a sexual relationship, but that God is one who wants us to be faithful to this relationship and really reminds us. So there are to be no other gods. And I think in this Lenten season, that too is an important consideration for us. No other gods. And we can easily make gods of lesser things. So just the final word, the next verse after our actual reading in Exodus 20, verse 18, when the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning and the trumpets, they were fearful and yet they were attentive. But they respond. The people respond to God's words, God's 10 commandments or God's 10 words. And that is important for us to respond to this invitation by our God. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. That there was a lot of material you had to cover there, and it's interesting. You pointed out that in the 10 Commandments or the 10 words that there's only one of the injunctions that's actually positive, and it's a bit of a pity, isn't it? Because so much what's there in the 10 Commandments, the underlying values are very positive about respecting others, respecting who they are, respecting who you are, and being content with all that. So it's one of those things, isn't it? It gives us an impression about thou shalt not. And of course, one of the things that one of the rabbis who taught us in Jerusalem said, yes, of course, when a commandment says that thou shalt not, you can rest assured that a lot of shouting is going on. You know, it's like trying to avoid, isn't it? Sometimes we're trying to protect values, but we can put it in negative language. But thank you for that, Mary. That's really good.
That's so true, Chris. So true. Thank you.
Okay, so you're on a roll. So continue
Yes.
on into our responsorial psalm. Thank you.
I am on a roll. Here we go. So our responsorial psalm, and it links very, very well with the first reading. It's Psalm 19. In our lectionary, it's called Psalm 18 because there are two different forms of numbering. And the response, and Mary Coloe will be joyful about this, is from John. The actual response to the psalm is from John. Lord, you have the words of everlasting life. So Kant, and he's quoted in Cohen, said, there are two things that fill my soul with holy reverence and a growing wonder. And the two things are the spectacle of the starry sky that virtually annihilates us as physical beings. And the second thing, the moral law, which raises our infinite dignity as intelligent agents. And I think this psalm picks up both of those things because it's a strange psalm. Many people have suggested that it was two psalms brought together, but we will look at the unity of it. The second major section of this psalm focuses on God's teaching, God's Torah, not the same teachings, but a much more generalized form of them, not the same teaching as we had in Exodus, but a more generalized form of them. And this psalm is a hymn. It's praising God for that. So it's not God's teachings are not a burden, they're a joy. And I think it's important that we remember that this psalm in its wholeness talks of two different self-revelations of God, one through the creation and particularly the sky and the sun, and the other through the revelation of God's teachings, which we find in the scriptures. So this one psalm, Psalm 19, has two main parts, and it's got a third part which relates it to ourselves. The first 6 verses about the heavens and the sun, the second 4 verses about the Torah, and then it moves to the self and the effect of both of these on self. I just want to talk a little bit about the unity of these two main sections before I move to the middle section or the second section, which is the focus for our responsorial psalm. Firstly, there are no examples in existence of the psalm in separate pieces, so there's no manuscript evidence that it was ever 2 separate psalms. In its vocabulary, there are 3 different words that are used in both sections of it. I won't go through the details of that. In its content, both of them are in a way about speech. The speech that the heavens make, the silent speech of the heavens, and the speech that the revelation in Torah makes. So both are about speech. And the other thing that joins them both together is the colour. The colour of the sun and the colour of honey and of gold, which the Torah is compared to a little later. So those things. The genre also of the psalm is hymnic. It's praising God, both for the sun and the heavens and for the Torah. And then finally, in the ancient Near East, the sun was, or the imagery of the sun was often a symbol of law in some of the ancient Near Eastern societies. So there are many reasons to hold the two things together and allow them to play with each other. When we come to the responsorial psalm, it's verses 7 to 10, and I won't go on to complain about the psalm being cut up. But these 4 lines tell of the impact of Torah on the individual. And in verse 9, both parts speak of the Torah as itself enduring forever and righteous altogether. So that's sort of the praise that it's speaking. And then finally, verse 10 introduces gold and honey, which are, as I said, it's the same colour as the light of the sun. And both gold and the sun and Torah both bring light. So there's constant interplay between these two parts. We come to our section that is the responsorial psalm, and it looks at the impact of Torah. And it says, Torah revives the soul, the nefesh. It's not soul, body, soul distinction. It's nefesh as the life of the person. So Torah revives the soul. And then in continuing in the parallelism in verse 7, the rule of the Lord, which is paralleled with Torah, gives wisdom to the simple. Another word for Torah, or another word used in parallel with Torah, are the precepts of the Lord. And in verse 8, they gladden the heart. And then in verse 8 also, the command of the Lord is clear. It gives light to the eyes. So these beautiful ways of describing the impact of Torah, this hymnic way of praising God for the impact of Torah on individuals. And then verses 9 and 10 move to the qualities of the Torah. The fear of the Lord, or the awe of the Lord, is another way of understanding fear. It's that overwhelming feeling. The fear of the Lord abides forever. So this eternal quality to God's teachings. The decrees of the Lord, all of them just. So the justice of God's teachings. And then in verse 10, it doesn't go on to use other words as parallels for these, the Torah or the decrees. It just says they. And in verse 10, they are more to be desired than fine gold. They are sweeter than honey. So the richness of gold, the wealth that it brings, but also the sweetness of the honeycomb. So beautiful, beautiful images here of the qualities of God's Torah, God's teachings, because Torah means teachings. It's often translated law, and it's a false translation. It really means teachings. So God's teachings, as God was teaching us in the book of Exodus, so God is teaching us really through the psalm, but in the psalm, humans are praising God for these teachings. And so I thought we might just pray this psalm together. I'll read it quickly, and if you could join in the response. The Torah of the Lord is perfect. It revives the soul. The rule of the Lord is to be trusted. It gives wisdom to the simple.
You have the words of everlasting life.
The precepts of the Lord are right. They gladden the heart. The command of the Lord is clear. It gives light to the eyes.
Lord, you have the words of everlasting life.
The fear or awe of the Lord is holy, abiding forever. The decrees of the Lord are just.
Lord, you have the words of everlasting life.
They are more to be desired than gold, than the purest of gold, and sweeter are they than honey from the comb.
Lord, you have the words of everlasting life.
And so finally, just to consider the relationship with all the readings. So Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments, is a relationship of covenantal relationship, and it's God's teaching the people how to be truly in this covenantal relationship, and the people learning. It's a teaching and learning relationship. Psalm 19, the joy of the Lord's teachings. It's both teaching and learning, even articulating it as we pray it. In 1 Corinthians 1, Paul is teaching Christ as the wisdom of God. And then in John's Gospel, John is teaching through Jesus's actions. So we go this week to teach and to learn from each other, and especially from God's word. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Mary. A lot of ground to cover, but what was lovely in this second section also is that you're talking about the covenant in your first part of the talk, but then moving on to the responsorial psalm, it's why what would be the advantages of joining in the covenant. And as a beekeeper, I'm very pleased to see that honey gets a really good sort of a billing there, top billing, as a way of talking about just how beautiful and life-giving it is to be in a relationship. And I think that's a great thing. Moving into St. Paul here for our reading there. One of the things that we actually have going on there is that it's the problem where the relationship has broken down. And one of the things you're talking about in terms of the Decalogue, the 10 commandments, or the 10 words, is that problem when we imagine God in the wrong way, creating our own image of God. And that's always a danger in the history of the world, really, isn't it? But one of the things that Paul is going to be doing is actually challenging his community to a right understanding of who God is and who we are called to be. So in 1 Corinthians, one of the things is Paul is dealing with two connected problems. The first was competition among the household churches that made up the Christian communities of Corinth over who were their spiritual patrons and the honor that they should be given. So you've got a beautiful picture of the temple of Apollo there in Corinth. So the second was the scandal of the cross for both Jews and Greeks. It confronted their understanding of honor and status in the most radical of ways. So dealing with the divided community, Paul earlier on has said, look, it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you. My brothers and sisters, what I mean is that each of you say, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. So the problem that they've got is that they're following certain patrons, and they feel that they're the ones who should be given the honor. And the end result of all this competition is that you've got a divided community. And Paul is actually horrified by that. So, but how is he going to actually deal with this situation? So one of the things about their world was that it was a world of honor and shame. So we need to understand that honor was a high value, and honor was either through rank or birth or earned through heroism or benefaction. That's why they're competing for honor, and we see it coming into the Gospels as well. So in a world where we talk about everyone being a winner, win-win situations, that was not really the way the ancient world worked. So honor was seen to be a limited commodity, and people competed for it or defended it. So just in terms of a little bit of historical background about Corinth, we know from Paul's letter to the Romans, he talks about the city treasurer from Corinth called Erastus. Now there is an inscription that you see here. You can see his name on in the picture there, Erastus. When he was aedile, so the treasurer of the city, at his own expense, he actually constructed this edifice. So we can see him actually working towards his own honor. This is the sort of thing that he's built this building and he wants everybody to know it and everybody to honor him for it. So it's interesting that Paul is thinking, well, this is the way the world works, but this is not the way we should be thinking if we're Christians. So this quest for honor, so that famous statesman, Cicero, said, in men of the highest character, noblest genius, there is to be found an insatiable desire for honor, command, power, and glory. This is the world that Paul grows up in. This is the world of his friends and Christians in Corinth. This desire for power and honor, competition was inbuilt into their culture at this time. Corinth was a place that was going somewhere. It was thriving. It was a bustling metropolis. It was very cosmopolitan. People were trying to make a name for themselves. And Paul says, okay, but this really isn't consistent with the gospel message. Just to give you a little bit more history, if you like, we have the Arch of Titus there in Rome. Some of you will have seen that. And one of the things that we have there, this was to celebrate the victory of the Romans against the people of Israel and the revolt that led up to 70 AD. From the Senate and people of Rome to Vivus Titus, so that means an emperor who has already died and basically become divine, the son of Divus Vespasian Augustus. So this was there, you have the triumphal procession. And this is the world in which Paul lives. So how is he going to preach this message of Jesus in such a world? How is he going to try and change these people's attitudes to one another, from competition to love and mutual upbuilding? So what does he do? He says, okay, let's go back to basics. Christianity 101. So this is our reading. While Jews demand miracles and the Greeks look for wisdom, here we are preaching a crucified Christ. To the Jews an obstacle that they cannot get over, to the pagans madness, but to those who have been called, whether they're Jews or Greeks, a Christ who is the power and wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Well, what an extraordinary claim to make. And I wonder whether any generation of Christians has ever really incorporated it into the way we see and act in the world. The wisdom of God, the power of God, is found in weakness, in a crucified Messiah. My goodness. So the wisdom of the cross challenges our view of the world, and basically it turns it upside down. So for Romans, the message of crucifixion was clear. This is how anyone who stands up to Rome will be treated, humiliated. Jesus was killed under Roman law under the charge of sedition. So, of course, this is a challenge for Paul and his Christians. So how could a faithful Roman citizen even consider becoming a Christian? And, of course, if this was God's power in action, it made no sense at all to people used to statues, triumphal processions, and triumphal arches like we've just seen in the Arch of Titus. And so for Jewish people, Jesus' death was a stumbling block. To say that Jesus' death was an obstacle was to say that it was seen to be a scandalon, an occasion of sin. How could it be that a blasphemer and one cursed by the law could be Messiah, let alone possibly be God's Son? So for Jewish people, Jesus' death on the cross was shameful. How could this be part of God's plan? As Paul says in his letter to the Galatians, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. So how could such a person be God's beloved Son? How could we possibly listen to him? Well, the short answer to that is the resurrection. Because the resurrection vindicates and honors Jesus. So in that beautiful hymn in Colossians, he is the head of the body. He's the head of the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. So this is where we find honor, someone who gave his life that we might live. And in 2 Peter, for he received honor and glory from God the Father when that voice was conveyed to him by the majestic glory, saying, as we heard last week, this is my Son, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased. So for Paul, honour is now going to be based on being in right relationship, being right relationship which is shaped by love. As Paul will say later on in 1 Corinthians, if one member suffers, all suffer together. And if one member is honoured, all rejoice together. So this is the call that radical call Paul is putting before the Christians of Corinth, and in fact Christians of every age. To love, to serve, to sacrifice, to find wisdom in the crucified one, which is ultimately about love. So as we continue in this week, reflecting and preparing for this Sunday, where does that leave us this Lent? How much do we, either consciously or unconsciously, seek honour or power? Do we let the wisdom of the cross guide our thoughts and actions? What kind of church are we building? What kind of church are we modelling? So, over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so third Sunday of Lent, and it's a reading from John chapter 2, where Jesus comes into the temple in Jerusalem, and there's a demonstration. Now, please don't call it a cleansing. It's probably called cleansing of the temple in your Bible edition. It really isn't a cleansing, as I'll explain. Every gospel has this story, every gospel. The Passover of the Jews was near. Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and in the temple, meaning the outer courtyards, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and money changers at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." That's the end of the first bit. And then we are told, his disciples remembered it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the passage begins with saying it was Passover. And at Passover time, every male Jew was expected to be in Jerusalem, to travel to Jerusalem for the great celebration of the liberation from Egypt. The sacrifice only happened here in the temple. So you have to imagine the crowd, the tent city, with pilgrims coming from Syria, from Egypt, from Rome, from everywhere. Now, if you live nearby, you bring your own lamb from your flock. But if you live any distance, you have to buy a lamb when you get to Jerusalem. So that's what some of these animals are doing out here in the courts. And this picture here, just to remind you of what the temple looked like, the outer court was called the court of the Gentiles. So Gentiles could come here up to this little wall, this little barrier. But then only the Jewish people could go through this gold gate into the court of Israel. Then there was the court of the priests. Then there was the holy place, where only the priest who was which at the time of the first temple had the Ark of the Covenant. So it was a time when just crowds flocked to Jerusalem. Now, this was also a time when you paid your temple tax. And temple tax paid for the upkeep of the whole temple system. But to make sure you paid the right amount of money, you couldn't just use any coins. You had to use coins manufactured in Tyre that were guaranteed to contain a certain amount of silver. So, like, they were certified, accurate. So when the pilgrim arrives, the first thing he has to do is go over to the money changers. And the tables aren't there all year round, but they are set up in the temple courtyards the month before Passover as a help to pilgrims. So he enters the courtyard, goes to the money changers, changes his money over, and then he's ready to pay the temple tax. So the other thing to be aware of is just the money involved in this whole system. Every morning, every night, a lamb was sacrificed, or the Holocaust lamb. So 365 days times 2. It's a lot of lambs. You've also got the upkeep of the whole temple, the oil, the wood, the priests. So it's a lot of money. So all these things in the outer courtyard are essential for Israel's way of worship. They're not polluting the temple any more than a charity box is polluting a Christian church. So Jesus is not simply turning over the tables, he's actually overturning the entire sacrificial system of Judaism. There's some other examples there of the sacrifice, the animals, the cattle, the doves. Now, the other 3 Gospels place this scene at the end of Jesus' ministry, but John places it here, the very first thing Jesus does in Jerusalem, his first public act. This is John's theology, John's way of saying there is a new way of coming to God. So as I emphasize here, everything Jesus finds in the temple is meant to be there. Jesus is not simply turning over the tables, he's overturning this entire sacrificial system. In other words, in Jesus, this system is over. The walls, the barriers, the veil were creating a barrier between the people and God. And what Jesus is doing is saying, this way of coming to God is no longer needed. There is a new way of coming to God. If you look at even this picture, you can see all the gates, the walls, and inside the holy place, the great veil. It's as if we put God in quarantine. God's been placed away from everybody, and it's been done by humans. We have shut God away. So when Jesus overturns the temple system, it's a prophetic gesture to say, no more walls, no more gates, no more barriers, no more hierarchies. God wants to be free. No walls, no gates, no barriers, no hierarchy. God wants to be free. Now, The next part of the reading then continues with characters who are called the Jews. And if there's time, Mary and I might say something about that in John. And the Jews understand the significance of what Jesus has done, because they don't ask him, why did you do this? Instead, they ask for a sign. What sign can you show us for doing this? They want to know what's Jesus' authority, because in the Old Testament, the prophets often had signs, like Moses had great signs to show his authority. The sign Jesus gives them is, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And they say, this temple's been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days? See, they're thinking in terms of a building. And then the narrator tells us, the reader, he was speaking of the temple of his body. And then the disciples remember this after his death and resurrection. You see, in John, from chapter 1:14, Jesus is introduced as the tabernacle. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Often it's read, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, or lived among us. But it actually uses the Greek word for the tabernacle. So this is the sign Jesus offers, that in his own person, God is now present. So the temple of his body is now where we are to find John. I'm sorry, beg your pardon. Now where we are to find God, the temple of his body. And at the end of the gospel, in the crucifixion, all this comes to a head. So the temple system is finished. It's over. God is coming to us in a new way in Jesus. Just a reminder, no more walls, no more gates, no more barriers, no more hierarchies. God wants to be with us. And this image here is when the Berlin Wall came down. Jesus did this action in the temple in Jerusalem. And the slide before said, God wants to be with us. Yeah, okay. But do we want to be with God? So my question to think about tonight is, well, what keeps you from God? If there are no walls and gates and barriers, what's keeping you from God? Maybe it's a past memory of something you heard or you were taught. Maybe it's the feeling of God wouldn't want me. Maybe it's the clock. I'm too busy. I don't have time. So, in Jesus, the walls were broken, barriers dissolved, gates were unlocked. So now it's over to you. What's stopping you? The God who is reaching out, what holds you back? That would be my suggestion for reflecting on this week. I might come back to that, got the question of the Jews in John, if there's time. I've got the ads. In terms of John, the friendly guide to John's Gospel, and in terms of the Jews, you might look at this hot off the press, A Friendly Guide to Jewish-Christian Relations by Mary. So both of those books speak to today's reading in different ways. And then the reminder, if you're able to help us, we appreciate it. Okay, David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Again, a wonderful night. I've just lost my chat window. I'll bring that up. I did ask if anybody had some questions during the night, but not many's come through. One thing I would add, just on the accreditation, Maria's asked, will the hours be accredited weekly or at the end of this program? The hours will be added towards at the end of the program, probably sometime in late April. There's a fair bit of administration that we need to do back at the office, so we'll do that as quickly as we can. But expect to see your accreditation certificates come through to you sometime in April. Be assured that we're recording them and double checking them, but they will be there in due course. I don't have too many slides. Mary's just said, Mary Reaburn.
There is a question.
Yep, I was about to say, yep.
David, the question said, when would you say myth or theological thinking ends in the Old Testament and true history begins? Now, I can't equate myth and theological thinking. So whoever asked that question, the whole of Scripture is theological thinking. It's experience reflected upon and shaped by relationship with God, by theology in that sense. When I talked about Genesis 1 to 11 being prehistory and in many senses myth, that certainly is talking about time before we have any historical indications. So that I would make that distinction, but the whole Bible, including the Gospels, are theological thinking because they are experience, in the sake of the Gospels, they are the experience of Jesus's life on earth and the experience of post-resurrection communities reflecting on it, telling time and time again. And so too with the First Testament, the Old Testament, it has a lot of theological shaping and theological thinking in it. It's telling, even when it comes to history, it's telling history from a certain theological perspective. And that's really important, I think, to make. So in no way am I saying it's all myth, but it is all shaped theologically. Thank you.
Could I add, Mary, that there are places when the world's historical background is sort of named, when it mentions Ramesses and the cities in Egypt. Okay, they're factual, but they're not writing history like we expect. They're writing their memories. They're writing their stories. I think we've got to be careful as to what we think or when we think history started to happen. People didn't have the tools. Even the Greeks didn't write history. It was wonderful interpretation of their memories when they wrote up supposed history. It's a very, very biased accounts of things that they remember, things that happened, but they're not writing it to tell history.
But we do the same thing even when we remember our childhood. We're retelling that history very selectively from our point of view now. So it's also very human to tell the past, a reflected past, but to tell the past from one particular angle.
Let's see if there's anything else in the questions.
Yeah, and that happens to this day in modern, in contemporary history writing. Um,
Yeah.
for example, war crimes that don't get reported, or things that are inconvenient to an ideology of a state or political party, or it's so often that we want to whitewash the view of history. But one of the things, if you were reading about the Peloponnesian War, so where Greco-Roman history writing begins, the author says, some of the speeches I heard, some of them were reported to me, some it seemed this is the sort of story, this is the speech that the character would have given or should have given at the time. So
That's right.
so you got all that occurring. There was a question though for you, or that you asked from Mary, from Mary Reaburn, yourself, Mary, that you asked, do you know when the Sabbath began? Was it in the exile, the Sabbath practice? Do you have any leads on that?
It certainly became more prominent during the exile, because in the exile, they weren't in the land. They didn't have the temple. The first temple had been destroyed. And they had a Davidic king, but he was a prisoner. So they didn't have those things that had become signs of God's presence with them and their response to God's presence with them. So the Sabbath, we don't know exactly when the thought of the Sabbath began, but it certainly became much more prominent in the time of the exile. For that reason, it was possible in the Babylonian exile, where they lived relatively well and freely, but they were captives. They weren't free to go home, but they organised their own society, and they seem to be able to have marked the Sabbath very well. So it became prominent then.
Yeah, and we know, of course, that many of them didn't come back from exile.
They stayed there.
And you
Yeah.
get the
There is
Babylonian
one,
Talmud coming from Babylon.
absolutely,
Yes,
absolutely.
much
That's it.
later.
Now, mindful of the fact that it's 8:03, but there is
Yes.
one last question that Michael Hill asked regarding the presence of the money changer. So this one's for you, Mary Coloe. Does the ritual purity of the donated coins play a role in the exchange system? For example, ensuring that coins placed in the treasury do not display unacceptable imagery, such as polytheistic deities or emperors with divine symbols. So reason why, so it wasn't just the wealth of the coin or the purity of the coin, but it was also the ritual purity of the coin that would be offered in the temple.
Yeah, I think the greater emphasis was guaranteeing how much the coin was worth. So it was about money. So
yes, but as the Ten Commandments say, the images, they had to also be very careful in that regard.
Sure. So the coins from Tyre just had such a guaranteed quality of silver, they could be trusted to be worth this amount of money. Whereas silver coins from another place, they might be 30% silver. Whereas from Tyre, there was a guaranteed amount. The imagery would be there too, but yeah, hang on to that sense of how much silver does it contain? Is it 100%? Is it 30%? Makes a difference.
A bit like American dollars today.
Yeah.
Is the goal that's behind it. David, we don't want to push our people, their patience too long, but did you want to say anything at this stage?
Can't hear you, David.
I've put myself on mute, which is my team's dream that they could do that in real life. No, I think thank you very much for tonight. It's great to see so many people engaging with us every week, not just here in Australia, but I noticed that there's some people from all over the globe, from Italy and Pakistan and India and New Zealand. So we thank you, those in Australia and those from other parts of the world at different time zones. It's fantastic that you can join us each and every week. So On behalf of everybody who has joined, thank you to Mary Reaburn, Mary Coloe, and Chris Monaghan. As always, you really do open up our Lenten journey, and the feedback is spectacular. So thank you very much. God
Very
bless. And we'll let everybody go and get a cup of tea or their dinner or whatever it might be, depending on where they are. I know I can smell my dinner in the background, so I'll start to get hungry. So God bless everybody and have a great
God bless.
God bless.
Yep, bye.